Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's Zoom conference. We have today two of the most knowledgeable speakers on the economic and financial opportunities that await the United Kingdom, provided that we achieve a clean Brexit. Our first speaker is Tim Congdon, one of the world's leading monetary analysts. Tim has had a distinguished career as a journalist and working in the City of London. He's published a number of significant works, including Keynes, the Keynesians and Monetarism, and Money in a Free Society. He's also acted as advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and much of his energies are now devoted to the Institute of International Monetary Research, which he founded at Buckingham University. Over to you, Tim.
Hello, everyone. And I just, first of all, just to put again an honor it is to be the British group. I hope all of the logistics and mechanics are in place, Robert. I'm going to be speaking to a short PowerPoint presentation. The key ideas I want to set out are to do with Britain's position in the world in the 21st century. And they're really concerned with our relationship with Europe in the world as a whole, and then how we are to be understood in this global context. For most of my life, the continent of Europe has been central to the way we think about the world. And it's accounted for a very significant part of world production, not so much in terms of the world's population. It's been richer than the rest of the world. And so it's in a way understandable that Britain, in terms of its land area, is such a tiny part of the world, should want to be close to Europe and all of the problems that we have. I think it's this sort of cartographic, this sort of picture from the maps that in many ways driven the kind of decisions that were taken in the second half of the 20th century. I'm going to argue in the next few minutes that we're in a very, very different world. And in the, Robert, if I could have the first picture, please move on. In this picture, which in fact I gave at a Bruges Group meeting in November 2018, I talked about the EU share of world output. And of course, the referendum to me was something that binds a generation. And perhaps it's going to bind 2 or 3 generations. They may change the view of that referendum back in 2016, but let's take it that in fact the referendum outcome will be relevant to our grandchildren. Now, my point here is that they will not be living in a Eurocentric world. The EU share of world output was 30% or so, including the UK, when we joined in the early 70s. It had fallen for 40 years or so to 17%. And with us leaving, it's now down to about 12.5%, 13%. So the great bulk of world output now comes from the rest of the world. And of course, in terms of population, Europe is very much overshadowed nowadays by Asia and other continents. Let's now think on a bit to the next 50 or so years, the world that our grandchildren will be living in. I'll be talking in a second about the demographics that are driving all this, but for some decades now, the population of Europe has been falling relative to that of the world as a whole. And other nations that were very poor back in the 1960s and 70s have been catching up, notably, of course, China, but other countries too. So that has also reduced the share of Europe in world output. And I find it totally plausible that by 2075, 2080, that Europe will account for I don't know exactly what the figure is going to be, but say 5 to 7.5% of world output. And so the world is going to be a very different one from that in which I suppose most of the listeners and attendees today have been living in. It will not be a Eurocentric world at all. Now, just to understand again what's driving this, and some of it is just demographics. And if you have the next picture, please, Robert. This is a picture that is based on projections from the United Nations. I should say here that they do not assume that current fertility patterns will continue. The projections would be a great deal more dramatic if current fertility differences between Europe and other continents were to continue. Instead, there's a sort of reversion to the mean going on, to a kind of world in which all women have getting on for roughly 2 children. They assume that in this medium variant that they have. But even in that variant, you can see that the share of Europe without the UK, of course, we're a European nation and I want us to be friends with the rest of Europe. Let's just be clear about what's going on. And then the UK itself, we're very, very unimportant relative to the world as a whole. And in the 1950, Britain accounted for about 2% of the world's population and Europe for about a bit over 20%. If you could have the next picture, please, Robert. You see we have there Europe without the UK, a bit under 20%, with the UK, a bit over 20%. And by 2080, you know, when our grandchildren will be sort of, I suppose, like many of us listening today, the Europe share of world population will be 5%, in the UK's less than 1%. And that's a big driver of this fall in the European share of world output. Yes, things may change between now and 2075, 2080. But these are the things that, these are sensible projections, medium to mid sort of compromise projections from where we now live. And now, this is the world we live in. And how, in this context, should Britain be framing its geopolitical strategy? I don't like nations having strategies, but how should it be positioning itself in the world as a whole? Well, I've been a Brexiteer for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. I never wanted Britain to join the common market, and I've always wanted to leave the European Union. And part of it is actually that Britain, over the last 300-400 years, has always been outward looking, outward just to the world as a whole. It's never really been this idea of, you know, Britain at the center of Europe. We never were at the center of Europe. We're always at the margin, successfully so. And I want just to finish now to make a suggestion about what we might do in terms of one key aspect of our associations with other nations. Of course, thank you, Robert. Of course, Britain was the heart of the world's largest ever empire, and that's all history. But the English-speaking world remains, in fact, in terms of output, totally dominant in the world, if it were not for China and one or two other countries such as Japan and Germany. Obviously America, with even today, about a quarter of the world's output, is the world's most important economy. China catching up, but perhaps China won't catch up, we don't really know. And then we must never forget that there are Canada and Australia. I think when you look at this picture, which shows the share, which shows the size of the GDPs of different countries this year, I think, by the way, they've kind of, this is from the IMF, I think they've tried to cut out the effects of COVID from this, but give a sense of the underlying picture. See, Russia is smaller than Canada, certainly smaller in economic terms than the UK and France. The 5 nations in the orange bars are permanent members of the UN Security Council, all of course driven by history. Well, I put it to you that the UK and French and German shares of world output, world population are going to collapse. And Russia, frankly, really shouldn't be there at all, apart from the fact that it's an international troublemaker nowadays. That's all. It's any reason it should be on the UN Security Council for a permanent member at all, seems to me. And what I want to propose today is that we should, if we look ahead, just the next picture, please, Robert. That Britain, with Canada and Australia, accounts at present for about 7% of world output. This is quite a meaningful and important group of countries. And I suggest that over the next 50, 100 years, the importance of Canada and Australia in the world economy will remain more or less as it is now. So I submit that we should invite Canada and Australia to join us in sharing a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. But frankly, we're not going to be credible 20, 30, 40 years from now. And I think we should look ahead and recognize that our situation in the world is one of diminishing importance. But we are important relative with our friends, and particularly friends in the rest of the English-speaking world. And I think this is one way of also letting Europe, and indeed our own citizens and so on, to realize that we're going to look out to the whole world in the 21st century and not look inwards to a continent that I'm afraid is of diminishing importance. And we need to be thinking about the world as a whole when we frame our geopolitical decisions in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that presentation, Tim. Now, our next speaker is Daniel Hodson. Daniel is chairman of the City for Britain Group and vice chairman of the Foundation for Independence. Daniel's also had a distinguished and successful business career, having been chief executive officer of LIFFE, that's the London International Financial Futures and Options Exchange, deputy chief executive officer of the Nationwide Building Society, and Gresham Professor of Commerce. Welcome, Daniel, and could you please make your presentation?
Thank you very much. I'm not going to use slides, I'm going to talk, and my presentation is going to be financial services oriented because that is essential to my background, but I will link up, I think, with where Tim ended, because I share his view of the way in which the world is going, and particularly the uncertainty of China in all this picture, but let's not forget India either. And the possibilities we have in terms of building a much stronger opportunity in the export business from this moment. I am also a declared Brexiteer, you can tell that, although unlike Tim, maybe perhaps the few things that I disagree with him about, I supported our joining what was then the European Economic Community in 1975, because I thought, I was deceived, I feel, that this was a common market, to use a very over-banded expression, which turned into a political project. And it is clear, and particularly clear as we look at what's happening in negotiations, that it is increasingly a political project. And the struggle that we're having to recapture our sovereignty in those negotiations is a perfect example of that. So let me start by saying we have in the City of London and our financial services asset, financial services industry, an asset which is a global leader alongside New York. I can list the reasons why. They have to do with time zone, with the complexity, liquidity, and diversity of our markets, with the depth of services, including particularly clearing, which is a complicated issue, but believe me, a very important one. We are innovative. We have people skills, very deep people skills. And I believe that what we've been able to do, and I'll give a perfect example in the past, and the reason perhaps why London is currently where it is we've been able to take advantage of change. Change brings opportunities, downside and upside. And the decline of Europe, Brexit, China, all these things bring opportunities. So the second point is the city prepared? Well, perhaps I can give you a little indication. We've been very welcoming to EU firms who want to set up in the city, and 1,500, I think as of September, had applied to set up in the city and trade in our continue to trade in our markets from the EU. And as an example, 31 English firms had asked to trade in France. So that just shows you what the relative popularity is. My friends, and I was chairman of a successful insurance broker for 20 years, and they are a very good example. My city friends have, on the whole, taken out the insurance policy of setting up as necessary in Europe. But my information is that they're not using those setups because they aren't at this stage necessary. Although it's interesting that we have offered the branch of equivalence, which means allowing firms which have from the EU, where of course the regulation is currently the same, to come over here given certain circumstances. That has not been extended to us yet. But I think the suspicion is that they will, because the city is needed to protect the Eurozone. The Eurozone banks are undercapitalized. Their assets in sovereign risk are not properly valued because all EU sovereign risks are taken with the same capital value, which of course is not the same. Would you value Greece with Germany, for instance? And 70% of all sovereign debt in the EU 27 governments was raised or underwritten in London. London handles 40% of all the asset management funds in the EU. The total size of the banking sector dwarfs the others, 10 trillion in the UK. Germany 7, France 7, Netherlands 2.5. So you can see the city is a hugely important player, and they need the Eurozone is potentially a weak member of all this, because there are financial issues in it. Those who attend this particular seminar will be aware of them. And there is a need for the city to continue to provide the liquidity in the markets to protect the Eurozone. But I'll come back to that issue a little bit later. So the next stage is an issue of deregulation. The level playing field issue permeates the whole background to the current EU negotiations, and nowhere more than in financial services, although as a matter of fact, they almost certainly won't be involved in these negotiations. And one of the problems is that in recent times, the city's regulation under the EU framework has become much more in terms of the way that the EU likes to do things. So the difference in regulatory culture between Europe on the continent and Britain is based on the Code Napoleon. Here, you can do it unless we say you can't. There, you can't do it unless we say you can, which has led to increased prescription, which has led to disproportionality and cost. And there are examples. I realize this is not necessarily a highly technical group that I'm talking to, but there are examples like MiFID II and Solvency II, where recent regulation led by British regulators, and this is important, and this is what the EU would always say, has contributed to disproportionate, costly, overprescriptive regulation. We need to roll back the carpet on that. I ran a regulated exchange. I was its chief regulator in those days, because there was a thing called self-regulation. But one of the things we did well, we never had any significant regulatory problems, but we also understood the markets. There needs to be a much better sensitivity. The outcomes remain the same, but there needs to be a much better sensitivity to what the market needs, so that the risks are managed with the same outcomes, but done in a different way. And that is an opportunity which will extend and increase the competitiveness of city markets. There are terrific opportunities in the future, not just out of change. And there is one particular thing which I think I will throw forward as a wildcard. The reason why the City of London is as successful as it is now is partly based on events in the US in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the US government imposed Regulation Q on their banks, which meant that domestic wholesale deposits, a percentage of them in banks, had to be placed interest-free at the Fed. This drove massive amounts of dollars offshore and created the euro-dollar market, which centered in London. Ironically, it was driven by American banks, but for instance, the bank that I then worked for, which was an American bank, had 50% of its wholesale deposits, a very substantial part of its balance sheet, funded out of London. And it was that more than anything else, besides all the other qualities of London and the activities there, which drove London forward into the position it is. Right now, the Eurozone is building rings around it. Moving money around is restricted. Moving securities around is restricted. Clearing is attempted to be moved over there. Clearing is a very complex issue, but it is terribly important, if you're managing clearing, to be a multi-currency, multi-product clearer. Clearly, if only euro clearing is happening within the Eurozone, it's creating the opportunity to create not a euro dollar, but a euro. Those are the sort of opportunities, I give that as an example, which the innovation of the City of London will drive forward, I believe, in the future. And then I just want to, this is why I link up with Tim. I think that the city will have an immense role alongside the sort of things that he mentioned in terms of diplomacy, soft culture, something he didn't mention, which is defense, because we still have defense presence in all sorts of interesting parts of the world, will also rank alongside the City of London, helping to finance a major export opportunity beyond the European Union. And one can see that he talked about Canada, Australia, and the UK. CANZUK is one opportunity. There are other similar organizations around there. Tim talked about it particularly in the context of the United Nations. That is one global asset which the UK still holds. But there are others too. And I suppose that I will end on the thought that this is going to be hard work, but we need to keep the city as flexible as we possibly can in regulatory terms. And we need to encourage innovation. We want to discourage oligopoly. We want to base the future of the city on those sorts of firms which have driven it in the past, which haven't necessarily been the multinationals. They've been the innovators, the SME financial service firms, and who, unlike the message from the multinationals in the main, have on the whole tended much more to supporting the Brexit idea. And the one final thing I will say is that it is my view that the city is now facing outwards. One thing it does is it makes decisions. You have to make a decision on the day, forget about the mistakes of the past and move forward. And very quickly, the city absorbed Brexit, said, regardless of how we felt individually, we're now looking forward. And I think that that is why, bottom line, the city on the whole is prepared for whatever happens on the 1st of January.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. Well, we've had two very interesting presentations, and I would urge you, ladies and gentlemen, to send in your questions to challenge our speakers. Now, the first question I got is concerning the current state of the negotiations. The question is, the EU seems obsessed with maintaining level playing fields, the judicial supremacy of the European Court, access to British fishing waters, rather than negotiating a free trade agreement. In view of this divergence of approach by the two parties, wouldn't it not be better to end the current discussions and return to negotiating a free trade agreement at a later date, once the EU has accepted that we are an independent nation? Tim, what's your response to that question?
Some of this is complex, but it does appear that the withdrawal agreement, and particularly the political declaration that came with it, were in effect a betrayal, sabotage of the Brexit referendum result. And you know, I've always been very suspicious of the wets in the Conservative Party, and I'm afraid the civil service in its handling of our relationship with the rest of the EU. And I'm afraid that the pair of them, in the form of Theresa May and Ollie Robbins, seem to have done a pretty good job in terms of messing up and effectively moving towards Brino rather than proper Brexit. Given that, it seems to be no harm at all in just simply telling the EU that we want to be friends with you. I want Britain to be friendly with its European neighbours, and I want strong, open, vibrant, dynamic trading and financial relationship with our neighbours. But they must understand that people in Britain want to govern themselves. They don't want to be governed from Brussels. So I'm very much in sympathy with the question that's been raised. Can I just, to finish on this, say that there is talk about Britain applying for membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes United States, probably with Joe Biden as president, Australia and Canada. And I wonder whether we can do that, given the terms of the withdrawal agreement that we now are supposed to put up with. And I have signed a letter saying we should actually get out of the withdrawal agreement. Perhaps I should stop there, but there are too many people in Britain who, because Europe is bigger than us and they're the neighbours on the maps, they simply think that then we are in some sense beholden to them. We are not. What I always say in this context is, look, Australia and Canada were our colonies, for God's sake. Are they told what to do by the European Court of Justice, by the European Commission, whatever? For God's sake, nonsense. We don't have to be told what to do by the European Commission. We don't have to take judgments of the European Court of Justice. Nonsense.
Thank you very much, Tim. Daniel, what is your response on this question?
Well, just to deal with the withdrawal agreement, I agree that there are many aspects of the withdrawal agreement, without going into the detail here, but those who are watching no doubt recognize them, which are extremely damaging post-Brexit. And the question is how you approach getting rid of those. And to that extent, I agree with Tim. The question was specifically about the state of the negotiations. And I think that the way that I read it is that the British government, I think, is pretty sound on the issue of retaining sovereignty in relation to these negotiations. So my current feeling is that they will stick pretty hard to their red lines in relation to fishing, sovereign right, level playing fields and jurisdiction. I think that it could be a mistake to walk away from these talks too early. But that said, there is no doubt that there is a natural termination date, which is the end of this year. And it's also created by the fact that whatever the deal is, whether it is one or not, it will have to be implemented in the relatively short time between now and then. So realistically, we're only talking about a week or two. But the withdrawal agreement is an international treaty. International treaties can be repudiated under the Vienna Convention of 1969. They can be repudiated partly on the grounds of loss of sovereignty, but also specifically on the grounds of not sticking to good faith in negotiations. I think you would all agree, if you take fishing as example, the suggestion which was being putting forward that in effect we simply passed over, we transferred the fishing rights around UK waters as now across to within the agreement, without in any way re-establishing our total sovereignty over those waters, is hardly negotiating in good faith. So I think it's very important that if we do walk away with no deal, it is then possible from a political point of view to persuade people that there has been a sufficient breach of the withdrawal agreement treaty for repudiation to take place. And therefore going the last mile in these negotiations over the next week or two may be a necessary step which the British government takes. So I'm talking from a practical point of view, but I certainly agree with Tim that these are execrable provisions in dividing the UK, and that is why, again, the Internal Markets Bill, which is so important, which is all about a union which has been in existence for hundreds of years and preserving that, and the intrinsic rights within that union, needs to be passed in some form before we leave. I agree with Tim on the whole that there may be a deal, but if there's no deal, the next step is to make sure that we put together some kind of package which ensures that these bad provisions of the withdrawal agreement are dealt with.
Thank you very much for those comments, Daniel. I think Tim would like to just come back and make a further few comments arising from that.
Can I just say I very much agree with Daniel that it's very important for us to act in good faith, to make clear to our neighbours that we want to be friends with them above all, and we want to have open, cooperative, rapidly growing and successful economic and commercial and financial relationships with them. I think the trouble here is that they simply cannot accept that we are not going to be bossed around by them, and that we are, in that sense, leaving, but we want to be friendly with them. And so I agree with Daniel that, I'm sorry if I gave the wrong impression, that it's a way we should try and keep the negotiations going as long as possible, even though we do wonder whether they're really acting in good faith.
I signed that letter too, as well, by the way.
Great, yes, yes, yes.
Very good, very good. Okay, now I've got a question here from Brian Weller, and please keep your questions coming because they're very interesting. Brian asks, can I ask about the Great Reset as a policy for a Biden presidency and the EU? Will they really try modern monetary policy in the United States in particular? This sounds like someone that's been following your comments pretty closely, Tim. Would you like to?
Yes. Okay. There's this thing called modern monetary theory, which basically says the governments can go to the central banks, borrow without limit, print without limit, and spend the money and enjoy it, and there'll never be any damaging consequences like inflation. That's just nonsense. So I won't go into the technical reasons why it's nonsense, but essentially there's a limit to the amount of money that people want to hold. They only need so much money for their transactions. And if the money keeps on coming out, then what do they do with it? Oh, if everybody's got, again, it's spending, they want to get rid of their money, then you get, first of all, a boom and a wild inflation. And I'm afraid that, well, what does the Biden presidency mean? It's possible there's going to be more of this budget deficits and printing of money. There's been quite a lot this year. And if you'll excuse my referring to the quantity of money, the increase in the quantity of money in the United States in the year to June was 26%, which is the highest figure since 1943, since the Second World War. And there was inflation after that. Okay, can I just, Mary, just make one point here, though. One thing I do like about Biden is that he is apparently eager to rebuild America's position as the center of the multilateral institutions, obviously the World Bank, the IMF, and then the World Trade Organization. And that is very important. Donald Trump was blocking the appointment of key people to the World Trade Organization as part of his protectionist, inward-looking agenda. No, we want America to look outwards. We want America to think of the world in multilateral terms. It worked with Britain in the after the Second World War and in the 20, 30 years immediate when we mattered still quite a lot to build up these multilateral institutions. And I hope that we can return to that kind of world. In that sense, I'm in favor of Joe Biden as president rather than Donald Trump. I have many reservations about both of them, but there we are. I'm afraid, just with one very final point, Barry, having said that, Biden himself says protectionist things. Not good at all.
Thank you very much, Tim. Daniel, have you got any comment?
I really don't. I think in the interest of encouraging as many questions about either, I will simply remain silent on this. I have my own views, but they're not too far away from Tim's, I have to say.
Good, I'm pleased to hear that. The next question I've got is from Ian Kirby. He says, I agree with the points made concerning the withdrawal agreement. However, we are losing the media battle and hence public support. How can we address that? Daniel, I suspect you've done quite a bit with relations with the media over the years. What are your comments?
It's a very difficult one. You have to have something which is saleable. You have to express it in a sensible way. I think that, unfortunately, this government has faced in the last, well, certainly in 2020, all sorts of challenges which are way beyond what one could have expected. And I think to that extent, you can't hold them wholly or even maybe partly responsible for the way that they've handled things and the mistakes they've made. But I think one area where they have been absolutely hopeless has been in terms of communications. And I think the example of Brandon Lewis getting up in the House of Commons and referring to two clauses in the Internal Markets Bill, in effect breaking international law, was a classic example of that. And those kind of gaffes really don't help to provide the sort of environment which you're talking about. So I agree with the point. It's quite difficult to get this across. At the moment, there's all sorts of screaming, and it permeated the Lord's debate too, about how ghastly it is that we're breaking international law. The fact of the matter is, we are not breaking international law. And besides which, the law of this land is determined by Parliament. Ultimately, Parliament is sovereign, and it determines whether or not we actually obey the treaties we sign. In this case, and I think that Tim agrees with me, the best way of dealing with the withdrawal agreement is to try to approach it within the context and framework of international law, i.e. under the Vienna Convention on International Treaties. And my view is that we have to put that across. One of the things which is going to be hugely important, and this is going to be a great test for the government, is that there's going to be, if let us say at the beginning of December, there is a walkaway by our negotiators, then the parliamentary shenanigans that follow, and particularly in relation to offending clauses of the withdrawal agreement, will be a massive challenge for this government, and communications will be absolutely vital. So I think that what I'm hoping is that a number of the fascinated and committed campaigns with which I work on the Brexit side of things will actually get out the message of about the withdrawal agreement, and perhaps that was partly the origin of the letter which Tim and I talked about, but also in terms of trying to get across the fact that it is perfectly legitimate and within the framework of international law to repudiate where one side has clearly not shown good faith in the negotiations. And there's more detail now. I'm using that as a headline. So there's a job to be done. I agree.
Thank you. Tim, what could we have?
I'm really very much agreeing with Daniel and all of this, but I think it's a shame in a way that at the moment there's such a lack of eloquence and passion in the public debate. And I think this is really why it's been possible for, really it was Theresa May and Ollie Robbins, pulled the wool over the eyes of the British public with these effectively very much appeasement kind of documents, the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration that came with it. And it's complicated. So Daniel, myself, other people have been in these campaigns for so many decades now. We face this problem that we don't really have a spokesman who can put our position with passion, commitment, eloquence, intelligence, and so on in the public debate. I think it's a terrible shame, Daniel probably won't agree with me with this, that UKIP is disintegrated. I don't know where Nigel Farage is going to go. I have my doubts about him myself, but for all that, he had passion, intelligence, and so on. I sort of, in a sense, just have to watch this space. I was active in UKIP myself. Perhaps I should have tried harder. There we are. I don't know what happens. And Daniel is absolutely right that if these negotiations break out without a deal, which seems to me to be very likely, that is going to be very difficult to explain to the British public what's going on without, somebody of this sort active in the public debate, or a number of people of this sort. Obviously, what the Bruges Group does, I suppose, Barry, it's why you're here, and bless you. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have figures like Maggie Thatcher and Enoch Powell and so on around at the moment.
Yeah, that's very regrettable indeed. It's been a long time since we've had anybody like that. So the political environment has very much been in a sense of drift.
We've had plenty of actors to play them, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. Daniel, have you got any comments on these sort of indications that Tim has put as regards changes in the future structure of British politics?
No, I think that there are a lot of tensions in the Tory party at the moment. I don't disagree with Tim that UKIP did a tremendous service in terms of holding the fort over the whole Brexit issue. Although Tim may not agree with this, I think the Brexit vote was won in the middle, and the middle wasn't necessarily UKIP voters. It was people who were persuaded of the sovereignty argument. That's not the way this is presented in the media. In the media, it's presented as people who were deeply anti-immigration and so on. I don't believe that. I think it was very much an issue about sovereignty, take back control, after all.
Yes.
I think that one of the interesting issues here is what is going on behind the red wall. Are they the silent majority? What do they think? And I think a lot of attention to that is going on in what you might call the thinking part of certainly of the Tory party. I suspect that it may have been one of the drivers of Dominic Cummings' views. Dominic is a man of great talent, arguably not always right, but he used opinion groups. He did understand how people felt, and I think he had a much better feeling for what was going on geographically than necessarily happens in Whitehall. So I think the red wall and how that goes is going to be a huge determinant, and probably, oddly enough, a conservative factor with a small c in terms of British politics in the future.
So is it your view that there needs to be policies that produce levelling up to take advantage of the political opportunities that the red wall offers?
I think that there are issues here which relate to devolution in terms of regional policy. I'm not totally convinced about the levelling up argument, but I think that there are a lot of movements within the whole spectrum of politics which are changing. I was involved last year in the run-up to the election. I was convinced that there were a lot of Labour Party voters who would never vote Tory. They might vote for the Brexit Party, and indeed they did in their massive volumes in the spring EU elections. But I never thought they would vote Tory. I got that wrong. They voted massively Tory. They're a very volatile sector, and they still are. And I think that they are the future direction of British politics.
Thank you. Tim, what about you? Are you a supporter of levelling up policies? And do you think that Daniel's right in his assessment that the Red Wall is the key political factor going forward?
I must confess, I'm not sure what this expression "red wall" means, but look, what I can say as having been active in UKIP was that UKIP was not a there was this sort of view that it was golf club salary kind of people. Yes, there was that element in it, but it was really all parts of British society, particularly of course English society, because there's no doubt Scotland is somewhat different. It was the Eastleigh by-election, I forget when it was it 2013, 2014? And I did some canvassing in some council flats there. And that was amazing. That wasn't just kind of, that was kind of 60, 70%, we're voting UKIP. And UKIP almost won that seat in that by-election. So yes, it is, it's very, very difficult. I'm obviously, of course, middle class, basically, but what I didn't understand about Theresa May was I just took it she was a relatively cynical politician. Didn't she see that the Conservative vote, the core Conservative vote, plus the UKIP vote gives you at least 40% of the electorate? All that Boris did, all he had to do in 2019 was exploit that fact. That's all he had to do. We don't really know what Boris really thinks. I mean, he's written so much about the EU as a journalist and so on, but there are still many people who are not really sure what he really thinks about it. And remember 2016 referendum night, he couldn't put the words together. He couldn't put the words together. We need somebody up there with eloquence, passion, and so on. And I really do hope actually something like UKIP comes back to wake the Conservative Party up. I'm afraid the way things are going, the Conservative Party will not get the kind of Eastleigh 60%, 70% of the council vote next to the next general election. No way.
Okay, just coming back to this question of levelling up, various policies have been suggested for levelling up, free ports, these sort of developments. Is that something that you believe, Tim, is worth pursuing economically?
I'm in favour of free trade. I want Britain to have free trade as a whole. Free ports may be a way of doing that by example. By themselves, they're a bad idea. Basically putting up barbed wire in your country to get this little bit of it, have a special trade regime. The idea of subsidizing the employment in free trade zones, which I gather is now one of the things in the Treasury agenda, utterly balmy. Now you can imagine my views. I'm a free trader. No, get the government out of things. Let people get on.
Thank you. Thank you very much on that. Right. Now, the next question I've got is from Andrew Sutcliffe. He says in the 2020s and 30s, there will be significant growth in GDP from new technologies that have hardly started yet. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, 5G, Internet of Things, etc. These industries do not have a direct correlation to individual national populations in the way that the 20th century economic models did. Does this provide an even greater opportunity for an independent and innovative UK to be a major economic player? but without the share of population. Daniel, have you any thoughts on these aspects?
Well, I think it's very easy to say yes, absolutely. And we're already demonstrating that, for instance, in fintech. It's also worth saying that a lot of this innovation comes out of research, and there's no question the quality of our universities are still absolutely at the top of the international league. So research is very important, encouraging development on the basis of research. So I think that's absolutely right. But I do think that we have to encourage innovation through flexibility, not through a dirigistic top-down, but actually encouraging businesses, no matter how small, to innovate, to move forward, to think of new ways of doing things, to use what's out there. And you don't do that by telling them what to do. You give them every opportunity to act as Tim would say, as individuals. So at least I'm in agreement with that. So I think the straight answer is yes in about 3 sentences.
Thank you. Tim, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, we don't really know, of course, which countries are going to be taking up these various ideas of blockchain and various things happening in IT and so on. And we don't know where the centers of employment and prosperity are going to be. I just think it's very important to let people decide for themselves what they want to do with their lives. And it may be, let me just illustrate this with Britain. 1960s, we were falling behind in manufacturing industry. So there are many people who are in favor of subsidizing manufacturing industry. No. What was actually going on was that Britain was moving in towards high value added services, financial services certainly, but also things like legal and accounting services and engineering services, these kind of things. And so we are now the second largest exporter of services in the world. Of course, much of it is through the city. And we need freedom. We need the ability to set rules and regulations. We need to be in favor of an open world economy, subject to international rules. Yes, but actually we must be able to influence those rules. And can I just say here, to be very provocative, Daniel will probably shoot me down as being very wicked, but I think we should leave the bank for international settlement rules. The Basel III, in my view, is a disaster in terms of the way banks operate at present. We should have the guts to do that as well. But I'm obviously I'm a bit of an outlier in these debates, but Basel III has been a catastrophe for global banking. And in terms of getting the City of London out ahead again, let's get out of that and really free up the banking sector again. I don't expect Daniel to agree with that.
Daniel, have you any comeback on this one?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the problem with banking is that it does require stability because it requires confidence. Otherwise, you get, in very crude terms, a run on the bank. And so Basel has provided that stability. I would have thought that a crisis, and there will be a financial crisis, they don't go away, they come and go in different shapes and sizes, but there will be one for sure. And that certainly I think that we can use our global leadership in this area to look at changes in which things are done in relation to Basel. And just to go back to a point I made earlier, that one outstanding hole in the whole Eurozone issue is the undercapitalization of EU banks on account of the treatment for regulatory purposes of sovereign EU risk, which is vastly undervalued. And as I say, it's because Greece is valued in the same way as Germany.
And that, can I just say, Barry?
Yeah, absolutely.
That provision, which says that all government debt has a zero capital weighting, is where it's in Basel III. It's in the Basel rules. Look, banks around the world know perfectly well that Greek government bonds are much riskier than German government bonds. It's, by the way, reflected in the pricing of those bonds, although amazingly at the moment, I think Greek government bonds, 10-year bonds, less than 2% yield. But the if there weren't the Eurozone, there weren't the artificiality, and there weren't, in fact, this provision in the Basel rules, then I think banking would be far more sensible. The Basel rules are part of the reason for these distortions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I've got a question here from Lindsay Jenkins. She asks, are the speakers reasonably satisfied that the British government, while focused naturally on leaving the EU, understands the dominance of China in international organizations like the WTO and its challenge to us and our allies? Well, there's quite an important question about China. Daniel, have you any comments on this, please?
Well, I think I would like to hear what Tim has to say on the subject, because he would take a broader view than I would, perhaps.
Would you like Tim to come in first?
Well, can I just make one point, and then
yeah.
And then say, I don't belong to the group which says we must shun China, a Trumpian view. I belong to the group which says there are two levels here. There's a strategic level where we have to live alongside China as one of the major global powers in the world, and an operational level which concerns trade and so on and so forth. And somewhere between the two is the sort of balance we need to strike. But we certainly need to be aware of the fact, and Tim outlined it earlier on, that China is going to be in economic terms massively more important than us, and probably dominant the economic power, certainly in their part of the world. But also, of course, there is an element of, interestingly enough, whether you like it or not, political stability about the Chinese regime, which gives it additional strength. Tim.
Okay, I think it's important to go back again to history. In the interwar period, we had a breakup of the world. There were different blocks. Obviously, there was the Central European bloc under Germany, and discrimination in trade and in payments. And after the Second World War, America and Britain sponsored a world order with a number of institutions, the IMF, World Bank, and so on. The idea was that there be uniform rules for all nations, no matter how large or how small, no matter how weak or how strong, and that there would be no discrimination between that you would not have, for example, a country saying, we allow our citizens to make payments to that country, but not to that country. No, it's a multilateral, non-discriminatory, law-based system that Britain and America built up after the Second World War, which then led to the global prosperity that we still enjoy today. Now, Trump didn't understand this. He was, in a way, the first American president who almost deliberately renounced it. And I think it's very important to make clear that Britain, maybe even the European Union, but we are very much in favor of that kind of world. Now, the worry about China is that it wants to have a second kind of, instead of having one world, recognizing one law, one non-discriminatory law and so on, it wants to have its own separate bloc. I think it'll fail to do that. I don't think it does dominate global institutions, as Lindsay claimed. I don't think it does. But it's very important that Britain and America be doing their damnedest to make sure that we continue to have the kind of world that we've had since 1945.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, just turning to a different issue, Peter sends a question saying, there are media reports that huge traffic jams in Dover are likely if there is no deal, and possibly even if there is. Do you think that's a real danger? And if so, is that the responsibility of the UK government because it hasn't prepared for such a scenario? Daniel, are they going to make traffic jams at Dover, and should the government have done something about it?
I can see Tim's gesticulating. I don't know whether that's, I'm watching a recording.
No, it's okay. Ignore the gesticulation. It could just be something that's...
Well, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of disinformation about this issue. This we've known about the fact that we would be leaving the European Union for nearly 4 years now. And there's absolutely no doubt that certainly business and certainly the freight companies, the people who are actually going to be doing the shipping, have done their very best to make sure they're prepared. Yes, it's certainly true that not everything is going to be absolutely perfect. But I think that this is going to be much more of a small earthquake in Chile than the media and those who wish Brexit to go badly would like. I cannot believe, and perhaps there are people who represent this kind of business, that SMEs in this country who've known about this kind of problem, whose very business is threatened because they're mainly exporters, have not actually found ways around in exactly the same. And I go back to what I said about the city. The city knew on the, whatever it was, the 25th of June 2016, that the world was going to change, and it started to react. And I think that if you're an exporter, you don't deserve to be in business unless you are working towards an outcome which got you over this particular hump. So I'm more relaxed about it than some, but I can see, and you have to be absolutely correct about this. Of course, Dover is not the only port. Oh, and by the way, Pas-de-Calais has a real problem here. You know, that's quite an important industrial site. I mean, the export-import business in Calais is important. But there are also competitors up the channel, across in Belgium and Holland, in exactly the same way. They're competitors in the east coast of England, around Harwich and Ipswich. So, you know, my instinct is that there is less of a worry about this than actually is being made out. Tim may disagree.
Tim, what are your thoughts?
Well, can I first of all just say that I don't know, in the sense that these are fairly technical issues to do with official documents, their wording and so on. But I agree very much with Daniel that, for heaven's sake, we've had, in fact, over 4 years now to handle all this. And it's difficult to believe that there's going to be a huge backlog of issues that haven't been attended to by the parties most directly involved. There is competition here. Calais is competing with Rotterdam and dozens of other ports all over the EU. They don't want to lose business. I'm sure everybody is trying their damnedest to make sure that the whole thing works properly. Can I just say that one of the only nation in the EU that seems to me to be at risk of significant loss from Brexit is Ireland. And I do worry about what's going to happen at the Northern Ireland border. In my view, this should not have been a big issue. There is obviously within the middle of the EU, Switzerland. There are no, you can just drive across the border. You don't have to show any paperwork there. And that's been so for 20 or so years. I can't think what the special issue is that causes so much trouble in Ireland. I'm told sometimes there are lorry queues. You can, as a driving in a car, you can just cross the border. There's doubt about that. I've done it. There may be lorry parks and queues there. Look, they get through, and the notion that the fact that there may be 1 or 2 longer delays for lorries, to my mind, this is not a fundamental issue relative to the sovereignty of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Daniel, I'm just wondering if you'd like to come back and comment on Ireland at all.
Well, I think that the one thing I would say is this, is that there's a lot of talk in the press. This goes back to the issue of communication and the ineptitude of it, you might say. There is a very clear case to be made for the withdrawal agreement being against the Good Friday Agreement, because it in effect disenfranchises the people of Northern Ireland in the format which was agreed in the Good Friday Agreement, which was all about giving relative voting to the two sides to protect both their interests. One of them had to do with constitutional, well, they both in effect had to do with constitutional changes. Well, clearly, drawing a border down the Irish Sea is a constitutional change. And
Right.
indeed, the provision that after 4 years or whatever it is, if the withdrawal agreement goes into action, they then decide whether you keep that down the Irish Sea, again, is against the Good Friday Agreement. So we have to be very careful to understand that some of these issues are being distorted for political reasons in an unjust and inappropriate way. And the Good Friday Agreement is certainly one. Someone ought to go and tell Joe Biden that. Oh, and by the way, just for everyone's information, out of amusement, Joe Biden's great-great-great-grandfather was Mr. Biden, born in Sussex, the county in which I sit, not so far from here. So much for Irish connections. His Irish ancestors were called Finnegan.
Yes. Well,
Wake fame.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But every American politician has to claim Irish ancestry because there are 40 million Irish American voters. So it's not surprising that he's done that. Now the next question is that 2020 has been a very surprising year. Nobody could have guessed what this year would have been like because of coronavirus, etc. Tim has talked about some of the crises that could potentially happen in the world. I wonder what our speakers think are going to be the big surprises and the big risks for 2021. Tim, have you any thoughts at all?
Oh yes, I think the surprise will be the buoyancy with which the economies come back, from the outfalls of 2020, and this really because of the rapid monetary growth that has been one of the features of the macroeconomic policy response. So yes, that's going to be, my view, is going to be a surprise. Well, it won't surprise me, but it might not surprise many other people. Yeah. And I think the way I put this is a bit like the end of
Okay, well, it looks as if Tim, unfortunately, has frozen at the point at which he was just making some very interesting remarks. Yeah, he's now not actually on the screen. We'll see if he comes back. Daniel, what are your thoughts regarding the surprises that we may be getting in 2021?
Well, I think I'm with Tim. I think that the markets will bounce back, but I've got a caveat there. And I think that the entrepreneurial and innovative way in which people in this country, for instance, have tackled lockdown and all the deprivations they've had to go through, and the way that it's bred new industries, admittedly at the expense of others, is a sign for good. However, I don't think it's over till it's over in terms of this, what you might call COVID period. And we really don't know what the foundations are fully going to look like as we look forward to the sort of economic, social, and industrial position post-COVID. But I share that. I think the big risk that I see is a financial crisis. I think all of us have been a little bit surprised about the buoyancy of stock markets. And I think we've touched on potential weaknesses in the Eurozone. So there may be something boiling up there. That would be the one risk that I would see, just for the next over the next year or two. But this was an unexpected, unfair question to your panel, and I shall think hard while we see if we can find Tim. I don't know. He looks. I can't see. Oh, there he is. He's come back.
Tim is back, yeah. And I wonder if just come back on.
I know I did get a cut off, but I didn't touch any buttons or screen or anything. Am I back in circulation?
You are. We can hear you. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you get my answer about inflation?
No, we didn't. Could you spell that out?
Okay. All right. Okay. Fine. Well, I've been arguing in the last few months that the macroeconomic policy response to the virus, large budget deficits combined with going to central banks to finance those deficits, has led to a surge in monetary growth. And I therefore expect that we're going to see inflation come back in the next year or two. By inflation, I mean inflation maybe of 5% or more. And not the kind of stuff we've had in the last 20 years or so. And so that would be, that won't come as a surprise to me. It would be a surprise, I think, to most of the world. And so that would be what I'd focus on.
Okay, Tim, when you talked about this very strong rebound, were you talking about both the United States and the United Kingdom?
Absolutely, and also, by the way, our neighbours in Europe, although probably less so than it's the United States which has had the extraordinary monetary explosion in 2020, really. So that's what I focused on in particular. Okay,
well, while you're away, Daniel talked about the possibility of a financial crisis next year. Do you think it's really pretty blue skies because of the monetary stimulus?
Well, can I just say, although I'm not that surprised by what's happened to the stock markets, given the scale of the monetary injection that's occurred. And in fact, in my commentary, I've kind of said that the surprise may well be on the, can I just make one point that is, I started off working in the City of London in 1976, when the yield on government bonds was up at 16–17%. And currently the yield on inflation protected index-linked government bonds is negative by over 2%. And 10-year British government bond yields are, I think, about 0.4%. Now, these numbers are just absolutely amazing. They do mean that it's relatively painless for the British government to run these large deficits, incur all this debt, because there isn't going to be, in the first few years at any rate, a massive debt servicing cost. I have to say, given that in the first 25 years of my life, people holding government bonds lost massive fortunes because of inflation and the rise in the bond yields, I do worry what's going to happen in the next 25, 30 years, given that we're starting from yields of just 0.5%. At least back in the late 1940s, they were picking up 3% or so. I mean, it's just amazing what's happening at the moment in government bond markets around the world. Who does this really affect? Well, I'm talking too much. I must leave Daniel to pick up that question if he wants to.
Daniel, there's a challenge for the final.
Well, I suppose, I mean, one of the areas that it affects is the pension industry, because which is dependent on the bond market as its backbone. And that affects us all, of course. And I think I'm a lucky generation because, when I started to work, final salary schemes were very much the order of the day, and retiring at 60 was the order of the day. Thanks a lot. I'm way superannuated as far as that is concerned. But I think that pension schemes of this type, long-term saving schemes are important for people's future, and that is going to be an issue. Tim, I'm sure you'd agree with that point.
I do, and I may be wrong about this, and perhaps I shouldn't say what I'm about to say, but I have a very strong suspicion that the reason that the index-linked yields are -2% is regulation. In other words, pension funds are being forced to buy government bonds at these ridiculous prices. When we were active in the city, or at least when I was active in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was less regulation, and this sort of nonsense wouldn't occur. It frightens me the extent to which decisions are now driven by regulation, and also that because people in the industry, they've got to talk to regulators, they're subject to regulation, they're told what to do by regulators. There isn't this sort of whistleblowing, for heaven's sake, that the regulators are doing is all wrong. And can I just say before, Daniel, before we finish on this, I really did mean what I said about Britain leaving the BIS and saying, no, we don't want Basel III. You know, some of the things that happened because of Basel III are utterly wrong. The cutting off of bank finance for small businesses and so on. These are dreadful things, all driven by international bureaucracies like the EU.
Can I just want to add one thing? Can I just add one thing to that? And a point I made earlier, and that is regulation has to be market driven, because we all know it's about outcomes which in effect reduce risk in markets. You can't completely get rid of risk. There's always going to be risk. In fact, markets are about risk management in so many respects. But the whole principle of regulation is one which must understand markets. When I ran LIFFE, we were our regulator, and we had a cottage industry associated with what we call educating the regulator, which was constantly being in touch with the regulator and telling them what was going on in the market. Now, I simply don't believe that there is that kind of close relationship between the regulated markets. It cannot be the case when you have, again, I'm going to slide into technical terms, MiFID II, which is all about financial markets, but prepared by regulators, I have to say largely British, who simply clearly did not understand or think through the impact on the markets they were supposed to be regulating, the cost, the reduction in liquidity, and so on.
Thank you. Well, we've had a tremendous session this afternoon, thanks to these two very well qualified and experienced speakers. And we've made a lot of progress, I feel, identifying issues regarding the continuing negotiations. And we've also had some extremely interesting insights into regulation. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening in today. And a big thank you to Tim and Daniel for putting the case so well and fully exposing their great expertise for our benefit. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, it was.
Yes, great fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.